The heir who never inherited. The short, doomed life of Alexander Onassis. The name that was a sentence. He was born into a fortune that could buy islands, yet he could not buy a single day of peace. His father's name was a thunderclap, Aristotle Onassis, the man who owned the sea. His mother's name was a whisper of old money and tragedy, Tina Livanos, daughter of the greatest Greek shipping dynasty of all. And Alexander Onassis? He was neither the thunder nor the whisper. He was the silence in between. By the age of 24, he had been a hostage to celebrity, a pawn in a war between titans, a pilot who preferred the sky to the boardroom, and a young man whose every move was watched by tabloids that called him Golden Boy one week and the Unworthier the next. He would never turn 25. He would never inherit the fortune. He would never marry the woman he loved, not legally, not peacefully. His death, on a bright January morning in 1973, would be ruled an accident. But those who knew him always wondered, did Alexander Onassis crash because the sky rejected him, or because the ground had never wanted him at all? To understand that question, one must go back to the beginning, not to the crash, not to the scandal, but to a hospital room in Athens in the spring of 1948, when a baby opened his eyes for the first time and the world saw only his father's shadow. The gilded cradle, the iron father. Athens, 1948. The birth of a prophecy. The Second World War had ended less than 3 years earlier, but Greece was still bleeding. A brutal civil war between communist and royalist forces had turned villages into graveyards and mountains into ambushes. In Athens, the scars were visible on every building: bullet holes, bomb craters, walls held up by prayer. Yet on the 30th of April, 1948, in a private clinic in the quiet suburb of Psychiko, a different kind of drama unfolded. Alexander Socrates Onassis entered the world weighing just over 3 kilograms, with a full head of dark hair and eyes that seemed, even then, too serious for an infant. The nurses whispered that he looked like his mother. The doctors noted that he had his father's hands, long, restless fingers that would later grip joysticks and steering wheels with a desperate tenderness. His middle name was not a coincidence. Aristotle Onassis, the father, had chosen it himself. Socrates, the philosopher who drank hemlock rather than betray his truth. It was a weight no infant should carry, but Aristotle was not a man who believed in lightness. He believed in destiny, in branding, in the power of a name to shape a life. He had renamed himself, from the original Aristoteles to the more international Aristotle, and he saw no reason why his son should not carry a banner from birth. The mother, Athena Tina Livanos, was only 22 years old. She had married Aristotle at 19, a union arranged by families who understood that shipping empires are built on marriage as much as on steel. Tina was tall, dark-haired, regal, and deeply unhappy. Her father, Stavros Livanos, had opposed the marriage from the start. Aristotle is a brilliant man, he told her in a private conversation that would later become family legend. But brilliance without kindness is a fire. You will burn. She did not listen. Young brides seldom do. Alexander was their second child. The first, a daughter named Christina, had been born in 1945. From the beginning, Aristotle treated Christina like a princess and Alexander like a project. The boy was quiet, thoughtful, prone to staring out windows for hours, watching birds, watching clouds, watching anything that moved freely. Aristotle wanted a son who would wrestle bears and sign contracts at 10. Instead, he got a child who preferred horses to horsepower, who cried easily when shouted at, who once asked his mother, "Why does Papa never smile at me?" Tina would hold him closer, pressing her cheek against his hair, whispering that Papa was just busy, just tired, just thinking about business. But Alexander was not stupid. Even at 5, he understood the difference between busy and absent. His father was absent even when standing in the same room. The Onassis household in those early years was a strange mixture of immense wealth and immense loneliness. The family split time between a penthouse in Paris, a mansion in Athens, and a yacht called the Christina, later the Christina O, that was more palace than boat. There were servants, chefs, pilots, security guards, secretaries. There were fresh flowers every day, even at sea. There was a constant stream of visitors, politicians, actors, shipping magnates, royalty. But there was almost never a quiet dinner with just the four of them. Aristotle was always working, always on the phone, always closing a deal, always leaving. Alexander learned to read before he learned to ride a bike. He learned Greek from his grandmother, English from his nanny, French from his tutor. He learned to swim in the Aegean before he could tie his shoes. But the most important lesson he learned came without any teacher. He learned that his father's love was conditional, measurable, and always just out of reach. The divorce that shattered the shore. By 1957, the marriage between Aristotle and Tina was a corpse kept alive by lawyers and publicists. The truth was that Aristotle had fallen in love, or something like love, with the opera singer Maria Callas. Their affair was no longer a rumor by then. It was a headline in every newspaper from Paris to New York. Maria Callas was the most famous soprano in the world, a woman of immense talent, fierce temper, and tragic vulnerability. She was also, inconveniently for Tina, married. But that did not stop Aristotle. He pursued Callas with the same intensity he brought to chasing tanker contracts, relentlessly, shamelessly, successfully. Tina could have tolerated a mistress. Many wives of powerful men did. But she could not tolerate the public humiliation. Aristotle took Callas to parties, to premieres, to his private island. He introduced her to his friends as my companion. He stopped pretending. In 1957, Tina filed for divorce in a Paris court, and the world chose sides. The custody battle that followed was not about the children. It was about humiliation. Aristotle wanted to punish Tina for leaving him. Tina wanted to punish Aristotle for betraying her. Alexander was 9 years old. Christina was 12. They were shuttled between Athens, Paris, Geneva, and London like diplomatic parcels, never staying anywhere long enough to make a friend, never sure which parent would pick them up for the weekend. In one infamous episode, Aristotle had the children flown to his private island, Scorpios, without telling Tina. He kept them there for 3 weeks, sending Tina a telegram that read simply, "The children are safe. They prefer it here." Tina sued for kidnapping. Aristotle countersued for defamation. The Greek tabloids called it the War of the Titans, and they printed every lurid detail, the screaming phone calls, the bribed witnesses, the forged signatures, the tears in court. Alexander remembered the smell of those years, aviation fuel, expensive perfume, and fear. He learned to read his father's moods with the precision of a radar operator. If Aristotle's mustache twitched left, it meant danger. If he lit a cigarette without speaking, it meant exile. If he laughed too loudly at dinner, it meant he was planning something cruel. The boy developed a stammer that came and went, usually when he was asked a direct question by an adult he didn't trust. He also developed a love for machines, not as power, but as refuge. An engine did not betray you. A plane did not ask whom you loved more. His first real friend was a mechanic at the Athens airport, an old man named Nikos who had worked on Spitfires during the war. Nikos taught Alexander how to change a spark plug, how to read a fuel gauge, how to listen to an engine and hear what was wrong before it broke. "A machine tells the truth," Nikos would say. "It never lies. If it is broken, it says so. If it is fixed, it runs. People are not like that." Alexander never forgot those words. Scorpios, paradise as prison. In 1963, Aristotle Onassis bought the island of Scorpios for a sum that was, even then, laughably small, approximately $150,000. The island was located in the Ionian Sea, just off the coast of Lefkada, and it was mostly scrubland when he acquired it. But Aristotle had a vision. He poured millions into transforming Scorpios into a fantasy: pink sand imported from the Caribbean, a Venetian-style villa with marble floors and frescoed ceilings, a helipad, a chapel, a zoo stocked with peacocks and gazelles, gardens of jasmine and bougainvillea. It was meant to be his retreat from the world. For Alexander, it became a cage. The island was beautiful beyond description. The Ionian Sea glittered like melted sapphire. The cypress trees whispered in the evening breeze. The sunsets were the kind that made poets weep and photographers despair. But Alexander could not leave without permission. His father's security men watched every dock, every path, every cove. When friends visited from Athens, they were vetted like spies. Once, a boy Alexander's age asked him, "Don't you get bored here?" Alexander replied, "Boredom is a luxury. Here we have loneliness." He spent hours in the small boathouse, repairing an old motorboat, then a speedboat, then a single-engine seaplane that had been abandoned by a previous owner. By 14, he could rebuild a carburetor blindfolded. By 16, he had flown a Piper Cub solo, without his father's knowledge. He took off from a makeshift runway that he had cleared himself, a stretch of grass near the northern tip of the island, and he flew for 20 minutes over the sea, feeling something he had never felt before: complete freedom. When Aristotle found out, through a security guard who had seen the plane take off, he was not proud. He was furious. "You could have died," he shouted, his voice shaking with something that might have been fear but sounded like anger. Alexander looked at him calmly, something he had learned to do in those moments when his father's rage threatened to swallow the room. "You would have bought a new son," he said. It was the first time he saw his father flinch. The Stepford son. Boarding school and broken telephones. Aristotle decided that Alexander needed discipline. He needed to be molded, shaped, corrected. The freedom of Scorpios, the unsupervised hours in the boathouse, the secret flights, these were not the habits of a future shipping magnate. So Aristotle sent his son to La Rosey, the elite Swiss boarding school that had educated kings and princes and the children of dictators. The campus was beautiful, a chateau on the shores of Lake Geneva, with manicured lawns and heated classrooms and a curriculum designed for students who would one day run countries. Alexander hated it. Not because of the classes. He was intelligent, especially in mathematics and physics, and he excelled in subjects that required logic rather than charm. But La Rosey was a place built on connections, and Alexander had no interest in making them. His classmates were the sons of billionaires, ambassadors, oil sheikhs. They played polo and discussed trust funds. Alexander wanted to talk about engines, about weather patterns, about the aerodynamics of a steep turn. He was an outsider among outsiders. His father never visited. Not once. Other parents flew in for weekends, for sports days, for parent-teacher conferences. Aristotle sent his secretary. Alexander's letters home were polite, empty, carefully crafted to reveal nothing. "Dear Papa, the weather is fine. I received a B in physics. I hope you are well." Aristotle's secretary replied with typed postcards, "Mr. Onassis acknowledges your letter. He is busy." His mother, Tina, was now married to the Marquis of Blandford, living in England, building a new life that did not include much room for her son. She sent presents on birthdays, sweaters, books, a watch, but the visits became rarer, the phone calls shorter. His sister Christina was at another school, beginning her own battle with weight, with depression, with their father's suffocating attention. They wrote to each other, these two lonely children of a titan, but even their letters were careful. The Onassis family did not do vulnerability. At 17, Alexander fell in love for the first time. Her name was Veronique, a French-Swiss classmate with curly brown hair and a laugh that sounded like bells. Her father was a dentist. Her mother was a schoolteacher. She was not from a shipping family, not from a political dynasty, not from any world that Aristotle Onassis would recognize as acceptable. And Alexander, for the first time in his life, did not care. They met at a study group for the mathematics final. Veronique was struggling with calculus, Alexander was not. He offered to help. She accepted. They spent the next 3 afternoons together, working through equations, and by the 4th afternoon they were not studying at all. They were sitting on the grass near the lake, talking about everything and nothing. She asked him what it was like to be an Onassis. He said, "I don't know. I've never been anything else." She laughed. He felt something crack open inside him. For 3 months, they were inseparable as boarding school rules allowed. They passed notes in class, met behind the gymnasium after dinner, stole kisses in the library stacks. Alexander wrote her poems. Bad poems, he would later admit, but poems. He told her things he had never told anyone, about his mother's sadness, his father's coldness, his sister's struggles. She listened without judgment. She did not try to fix him. She just stayed. Aristotle found out, of course. He had eyes everywhere. A phone call came to La Rose's headmaster, then another to Alexander's dormitory. Alexander was summoned to Paris, to his father's office on Avenue Foch, a building that smelled of leather and old money and power. The conversation was brief, brutal, and unforgettable. "You do not marry for love," Aristotle said, standing behind his desk, not sitting, because sitting would have implied equality. "You marry for alliance. Love is a luxury you cannot afford. I did not build an empire so you could throw it away on a dentist's daughter." Alexander said nothing. He had learned that arguing with his father was like arguing with a storm, you only got wetter. He stood there, hands at his sides, face neutral, and waited. Aristotle went on for another 10 minutes, about duty, about legacy, about the millions of dollars that would one day be Alexander's responsibility. When he finished, he lit a cigarette and looked at his son. "You will not see her again," he said. It was not a question. Alexander did not see Veronique again. He returned to La Rose, found her in the dining hall, and told her that his father had forbidden the relationship. She cried. He did not. But that night, in his dormitory room, with the door locked and the lights off, he sat on the edge of his bed and stared at the wall for 3 hours. Something inside him hardened that night. Something that would never soften again. He stopped writing letters home. He stopped smiling in photographs. He became, in the words of one classmate, a ghost who attended class. The crash of the golden boy. The tabloids began circling in earnest when Alexander turned 18. He was handsome in a melancholic way, dark hair, pale skin, his mother's aristocratic cheekbones, his father's fierce eyes. The press called him Aristotle's heir apparent, but also the reluctant prince and, less kindly, the billionaire's bummer. He was photographed leaving nightclubs in London, riding motorcycles too fast on the streets of Athens, once climbing the Acropolis at midnight with a group of friends from the flying club. Each photo came with a caption dripping with mockery: "Will the little Onassis ever work a day in his life?" The golden boy tarnishes another evening. Alexander Onassis, heir today, gone tomorrow. The truth was crueler than the headlines. Alexander wanted to work. He had a passion for aviation that was genuine, technical, obsessive. He earned his commercial pilot's license at 19, then his helicopter license, then his multi-engine rating. He could read weather maps better than some meteorologists. He spent hours in the cockpit of Olympic Airways planes, not as a passenger but as a co-pilot, unpaid, unthanked, but happy. The pilots loved him because he was competent, humble, and never pulled rank. The mechanics loved him because he knew their tools and their slang. For the first time in his life, Alexander had found a place where he was judged not by his name but by his skill. His father saw this as a hobby, not a career. "You will join the company," Aristotle said in the summer of 1970, during a tense dinner on Scorpios. "You will learn shipping. You will marry a suitable girl. You will produce heirs. That is your life." Alexander said no. It was the first time he had ever openly defied his father. The argument lasted 6 hours, moving from the dining room to the study to the terrace to the dock. Secretaries heard shouting in Greek, then English, then Greek again. At one point, Aristotle threw a glass of ouzo against the wall, where it shattered and stained the white plaster like blood. At another, Alexander reportedly said, "You don't want a son. You want a mirror." He walked out. He did not speak to his father for 4 months. He moved into a small apartment in Athens, far from Scorpios, far from the yacht, far from the servants and the security and the gilded cage. He lived simply. A bed, a table, a stack of aviation manuals, a photograph of his mother. He flew for Olympic Airways as a co-pilot on domestic routes, earning a salary that would have been laughable to his father but felt like gold to him. He was free. The father's new wife, Jacqueline Kennedy. By 1968, Aristotle had remarried. Not to Maria Callas, as everyone expected, but to Jacqueline Kennedy, the widow of the murdered American president. The world gasped. Jackie was American royalty, Catholic, elegant, and famously private. Aristotle was a Greek tycoon, orthodox, brash, and famously public. The wedding on Scorpios was a media circus, helicopters buzzing overhead, paparazzi hiding in fishing boats, reporters bribing servants for scraps of information. And it was a disaster for Alexander. Jackie was not cruel to him. In fact, she was distant but polite, the way one might be polite to a colleague's child at a company picnic. She called him Alexander, never Alex or Sandy, or any of the nicknames his friends used. She asked about his flying with the same vague interest she might have shown in a news item about a foreign election. But her presence changed everything. Suddenly, Scorpios had a new queen. Aristotle doted on Jackie, bought her millions in jewelry from Harry Winston, redecorated the villa for her taste, white sofas, French antiques, fresh peonies flown in from Holland every week. Alexander and Christina became afterthoughts, furniture in their own home. One evening, Alexander overheard his father say to a guest, a shipping magnate from Norway, "Jackie brings me peace. My children only bring me problems." He was 20 years old. He went to his room, sat on the bed, and did not cry. He later told a friend, "I realized that night that I was not a son to him. I was a line in his will." The relationship between Alexander and Jackie never improved. They were not enemies. There was no drama, no shouting, no public scenes. They simply did not matter to each other. Jackie was absorbed in her own world of fashion, art, and social climbing. Alexander was absorbed in his world of engines, altimeters, and approach patterns. They coexisted on Scorpios like two planets in the same solar system, orbiting the same sun but never touching. Christina, meanwhile, was falling apart. She was 20 years old, overweight, deeply insecure, and addicted to diet pills and champagne. She had inherited her father's temper and her mother's melancholy, and neither served her well. She hated Jackie with a passion that bordered on mania, not because Jackie had done anything to her, but because Jackie had taken the attention that Christina desperately craved. The two women once had a screaming fight in the villa's kitchen that ended with Christina throwing a crystal vase at Jackie's head. She missed. The vase shattered against the wall, and Jackie reportedly said, "That was baccarat, Christina. Have some class." Alexander tried to protect his sister, but he didn't know how. He was drowning himself. In the winter of 1971, he began drinking heavily, whiskey, mostly, straight from the bottle. He would fly hungover, a secret he kept from the airline but not from his body. His hands shook on the yoke. His vision blurred on final approach. He knew he was playing a dangerous game, but he didn't know how to stop. The sky had been his refuge, and now even the sky was turning against him. The lovers, the lies, the flight. Fiona, the woman he could not keep. In the spring of 1971, at a party in London thrown by a mutual friend of the Onassis and Thyssen families, Alexander met Fiona von Thyssen. She was German, beautiful in a sharp, angular way, high cheekbones, pale blue eyes, hair the color of honey. She was also married to the Baron von Thyssen, an industrialist 40 years her senior. The Baron was old, wealthy, and famously indifferent to his young wife. He spent most of his time in Switzerland, managing his art collection and his steel mills, leaving Fiona to wander Europe like a ghost. She and Alexander began an affair that was less about sex and more about recognition. Fiona listened to him. She did not interrupt. She did not change the subject. She remembered the names of his childhood pets, a dog named Odysseus, a parrot named Plato. She laughed at his jokes, even the bad ones. For the first time since Veronique, Alexander felt seen. They met in secret, at first, hotel rooms in Geneva, rented houses in the south of France, the guest cottage on Scorpios when Aristotle was away. Fiona would fly in from Zurich, Alexander would fly in from Athens. They would spend 2 or 3 days together, talking, cooking, making love, and then they would separate, returning to their separate cages. It was not enough. It was never enough. The tabloids had a field day when the affair became public. Onassis heir in love nest with Baroness, screamed the Daily Express. Scandal on Scorpios, shouted the Paris Match. The photographs were grainy but unmistakable, Alexander and Fiona holding hands in a cafe in Saint-Tropez, kissing on a balcony in Monte Carlo, boarding a plane together in Nice. Aristotle was livid, not because of the morality, but because of the publicity. He had spent years cultivating an image of respectability, of dynastic power. A son sleeping with a married baroness did not fit that image. He summoned Alexander to the Christina O, anchored off Monte Carlo. The conversation was short, brutal, and almost identical to the Veronique conversation of 5 years earlier. End it, Aristotle said. Or I will end your allowance, your planes, your future. Alexander refused. He did not shout. He did not argue. He simply said, no. Aristotle was so shocked that he could not speak for a full 10 seconds. His son, his obedient, frightened, stammering son, had said no. Then the rage came. Aristotle threatened disinheritance, public humiliation, legal action against Fiona. He called the Baron himself. The details of that call are lost to history, but the aftermath is well documented. Within weeks, Fiona was in Switzerland, under the Baron's watchful eye, and Alexander was in Athens, forbidden from contacting her. They wrote letters anyway, smuggled through a sympathetic steward on the Christina O. In one surviving fragment, Alexander wrote, "They want us to be ghosts to each other. But I would rather be a ghost with you than a prince alone." In another, Fiona replied, "I would burn every castle in Europe to sit with you in a small room with a single candle. Do not give up." They never stopped loving each other. They also never lived together. The Baron would not grant a divorce, not out of love for Fiona, but out of spite for Aristotle. And Aristotle, for all his power, could not force a German industrialist to bend. So Alexander and Fiona remained what they had always been. A secret, a scandal, a story that ended badly. The crash of 1972, a warning. On a foggy night in July 1972, Alexander was flying a Piaggio P.166 from Athens to Rome. He had a co-pilot, a Greek named Andreas, and no passengers. The flight was routine, a delivery mission for Olympic Airways, nothing more. But over the Ionian Sea, at 8,000 feet, both engines failed simultaneously. Alexander's training kicked in. He did not panic. He did not freeze. He radioed Mayday, declared an emergency, and began troubleshooting. Fuel pressure was 0. Oil pressure was 0. Both engines were dead. He had maybe 3 minutes before the plane would become a glider, then a rock. He chose to ditch, to land on the water rather than attempt a dead-stick landing on an unknown beach. He lined up with the waves, reduced his airspeed, and touched down in a trough between two swells. The impact was brutal but survivable. The plane's nose dug into the water, the fuselage cracked, and cold seawater poured into the cockpit. Alexander unbuckled, pulled Andreas free, and pushed him toward the emergency raft. They were in the water for 3 hours before a Greek freighter spotted their flares and picked them up. Alexander walked away with a bruised rib and a deep gash on his forehead. He needed 7 stitches. Andreas had a broken arm and a concussion, but he would live. The aviation authorities later found water in the fuel tanks, contamination, they said, probably from a faulty seal at the Athens airport. But the report was inconclusive. Sabotage? Negligence? Bad luck? No one could say for certain. Alexander called his father from the hospital in Corfu. Aristotle's response was not what he had hoped for. There was no "thank God you're alive." No, I was so worried. Instead, Aristotle asked, was the plane insured? Alexander hung up without answering. He told a friend later that week, he didn't even come to the hospital. He sent his accountant. The friend, a fellow pilot named Dimitri, said Alexander laughed when he said it. But it was the kind of laugh that comes from a place too deep for tears. That winter, Alexander wrote a will. He was 23 years old. He left everything he owned, which was not much, because his father controlled the trust funds and the properties and the yachts and the planes, to Christina. He added a handwritten note, which he sealed in an envelope with his lawyer. If I die before Papa, tell him I finally did something he didn't order. The lawyer kept the note for 40 years before releasing it to a biographer. By then, everyone involved was dead. The last flight. January 22, 1973, a bright Monday. The morning was cold but clear. Athens Hellenican Airport gleamed under a winter sun, the runways still wet from an early rain. Alexander arrived at 9:30 a.m. alone, carrying a leather flight bag that had belonged to his grandfather. He was wearing a brown leather jacket, jeans, and his favorite pair of aviator sunglasses, the same pair he had worn on his first solo flight. He looked, according to the airport security guard who logged him in, calm, even cheerful. He was scheduled to test a new aircraft, a Piaggio Avanti, a twin-engine turboprop that had been modified with experimental avionics for a potential sale to Olympic Airways. The plane was sleek, futuristic, a dream machine for any pilot. Alexander had been lobbying for months to be the one to test it. His father had finally agreed, reluctantly, as a kind of peace offering after their latest argument about Fiona. His co-pilot was Donald McCusker, a 39-year-old American former Air Force pilot who had flown combat missions in Vietnam. McCusker was experienced, steady, and unfailingly professional. He had flown with Alexander several times before and respected the young Onassis' skills. "He's better than most of the pros I know," McCusker had told his wife the night before. "If I have to go up with anyone, I'm glad it's him." A flight engineer, George Stilliner, was also aboard. Stilliner was a recent hire, a quiet Cypriot who kept to himself. He had never flown with Alexander before. He was nervous, but he hid it well. At 10:05 a.m., the Piaggio lifted off from runway 33L. The takeoff was normal, smooth rotation, positive climb, gear up. The plane climbed to 1,500 feet, banked right to avoid the airport's traffic pattern, then leveled out. Witnesses on the ground saw nothing unusual. A baggage handler later told investigators that he saw the plane's navigation lights blinking in sequence, standard procedure. At 10:09 a.m., everything changed. The plane went into a sudden, violent dive, nose down, 45 degrees, then 60, then 90. It fell from the sky like a stone. Witnesses said they heard the engine screaming, then a sound like a bomb, then silence. The plane struck the runway approach lights at the eastern end of the airport, then hit the ground, exploding into a fireball visible from the terminal. Debris rained down for hundreds of meters. A piece of the fuselage landed on the roof of a hangar. A tire bounced across the tarmac and came to rest near a fuel truck. Donald McCusker and George Stilliner died instantly. The impact had crushed their bodies beyond recognition. Alexander was thrown clear of the wreckage. The fuselage had split open on impact, and he had been ejected like a stone from a sling. He landed in a patch of grass 50 meters from the main fire. He was still alive, but barely. His injuries were catastrophic. A fractured skull, third-degree burns over 60% of his body, a collapsed lung, a severed spine, and internal bleeding so severe that his blood pressure was undetectable. He was rushed to the KAT hospital in Athens, the same hospital where he had been born 24 years earlier. The ambulance arrived at 10:27 a.m. He never regained consciousness. The vigil. Aristotle Onassis was in Paris when the call came. He was in a meeting with his bankers, discussing a merger, when his personal secretary interrupted. The secretary whispered in his ear. Aristotle's face, always controlled, always composed, went white. He stood up without a word, walked out of the room, and did not return. He was on his private jet within the hour, flying to Athens. He arrived at the hospital at 2 p.m., pale, shaking, a man who had never shown weakness in public now unable to hide it. He demanded the best doctors, the best equipment, the best everything. He offered to fly in specialists from the United States, from Switzerland, from anywhere. But there was nothing anyone could do. Alexander's brain was swelling beyond surgical repair. His organs were failing one by one. The burns were too extensive, the internal injuries too severe. The doctors gave him a 0% chance of survival. Christina arrived from London on the next flight. She was hysterical, weeping, screaming. She threw herself on Alexander's bed, clutching his burned hands, begging him to wake up. "Wake up! Wake up!" she shouted. "You can't leave me alone with him." Nurses had to pull her away. She collapsed in the hallway, sobbing, and did not move for 2 hours. Tina, his mother, flew in from Switzerland. She had not seen Alexander in nearly a year. Their relationship had been strained, not because they didn't love each other, but because she had remarried again and moved to London, and the distance had grown. She arrived at the hospital in a state of controlled shock, her face a mask of frozen grief. She did not cry in public. She did not scream. She simply sat by Alexander's bed, holding his hand, whispering something that no one else could hear. Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis did not come. She was in New York, at her apartment on Fifth Avenue, preparing for a charity gala. Aristotle called her. He begged her to come. She said she would try. She did not try. She sent flowers, a large arrangement of white lilies, with a card that read simply, "With deepest sympathy." The flowers arrived after Alexander was dead. For 3 days, Alexander clung to life by threads. Machines breathed for him. Machines pumped blood through his body. Machines monitored the faint electrical signals of a brain that was slowly shutting down. On the morning of January 25, 1973, his heart stopped. The doctors tried to restart it. They failed. At 2:55 p.m., Alexander Socrates Onassis was pronounced dead. He was 24 years old. The official cause of death was listed as massive head trauma due to aircraft accident. The official cause of the accident was listed as pilot error. Specifically, Alexander had allegedly failed to release the gust lock on the plane's controls before takeoff. The gust lock was a metal pin that prevented the control surfaces from moving while the plane was parked. If it was still engaged during takeoff, the pilot would have no control over the plane's pitch or roll. The plane would climb for a few seconds, then stall, then dive. But the investigation was rushed, the evidence burned beyond recognition, and the chief investigator was a close friend of Aristotle's. To this day, aviation experts debate whether it was truly pilot error or a mechanical failure. Some point to the water contamination in the 1972 crash and whisper of sabotage. Alexander had enemies, they say, in the shipping world, men who wanted Aristotle to suffer. Others point to Alexander's drinking, his fatigue, his distracted state. No proof has ever emerged. The black box, if there was one, was destroyed in the fire. But proof was beside the point. The heir was dead. The aftermath, a family destroyed. Aristotle's descent. Aristotle Onassis never recovered from his son's death. He aged 10 years in 6 months. His hair, which had been jet black at 66, turned gray almost overnight. His health, which had been robust, began to fail, his heart, his lungs, his nerves. He stopped eating. He stopped sleeping. He stopped attending meetings. The man who had built an empire from nothing, who had outsmarted governments and outlasted rivals, now spent his days sitting in a chair on Scorpios, staring at the sea, drinking whiskey and saying nothing. He tried to sell the island. He couldn't. Every time a buyer expressed interest, Aristotle would cancel the deal at the last minute, unable to part with the place where Alexander had spent his childhood. He tried to sell the yacht. He couldn't. He tried to sell Olympic Airways. He couldn't. Everything reminded him of Alexander, the planes, the boats, the islands, the airports. There was nowhere he could go without seeing his son's ghost. He commissioned a white marble tomb on Scorpios, in a small clearing near the villa, facing the sea. The inscription was simple: Alexander Onassis, 1948 to 1973. No titles. No epitaphs. No heir. Just his name and the dates. Aristotle visited the tomb every day, sometimes twice a day, sitting on a stone bench and talking to the grave. What he said, no one knows. The guards kept their distance. He tried to reconcile with Christina, but it was too late. She blamed him for Alexander's death, not directly, not logically, but in the way that grief blames everything. If you had let him live his own life, she screamed at him once, he would still be alive. Aristotle did not argue. He simply nodded, walked away, and poured himself another whiskey. In 1974, his health collapsed completely. He was diagnosed with myasthenia gravis, a neuromuscular disease that left him weak, trembling, and unable to swallow. He spent his final months in a Paris hospital, surrounded by nurses and lawyers, visited by almost no one. Christina came once. They sat in silence for an hour. Jackie came once, briefly, but she was already building a new life as a book editor in New York, and she seemed more relieved than sad. Aristotle Onassis died on March 15, 1975, at the age of 69. His last word, according to the nurse who was holding his hand, was Alexander. He was buried on Scorpios, in a tomb next to his sons. Father and son, together at last, in the only way they had ever known how, in silence. Christina's tragedy. Christina Onassis inherited everything: the fortune, the yachts, the islands, the airlines, the art, the jewelry, the debts, the enemies, the expectations. She was 24 years old, the same age Alexander had been when he died. She was also overweight, depressed, addicted to diet pills and champagne, and completely unprepared for the burden that had been placed on her shoulders. She tried. She really did. She took over the shipping company, firing executives who had been loyal to her father, hiring her own people. She negotiated deals, attended board meetings, signed contracts. But she hated it. She hated the men in suits who looked at her with a mixture of contempt and desire. She hated the journalists who called her the Onassis heiress and speculated about her weight and her love life. She hated the loneliness of the boardroom, the coldness of the yacht, the emptiness of Scorpios. So she married. 4 times. Her first husband was a wealthy American real estate developer named Joseph Boca. They divorced after 9 months. Her second husband was a Greek shipping heir named Alexander Onassis. They divorced after 14 months. Her third husband was a Soviet shipping agent named Sergei Kauzov, a man widely believed to be a KGB agent. That marriage lasted 16 months and nearly cost her her fortune. Her fourth husband was a French businessman named Thierry Roussel. They had a daughter, Athena, born in 1985. That marriage lasted 3 years. Each marriage ended the same way, with Christina weeping, with lawyers circling, with tabloids jeering. She poured her pain into food and drugs. She would binge eat for days, then starve herself for weeks. She mixed champagne with barbiturates, diet pills with vodka. Her body, already weakened by years of abuse, began to fail. In November 1988, Christina flew to Buenos Aires to attend the wedding of a friend. She was alone, no husband, no daughter, no bodyguard. She checked into a hotel, ordered room service, and was found dead the next morning. The official cause of death was a heart attack, brought on by years of anorexia, bulimia, and drug abuse. She was 37 years old. She was buried on Scorpios, next to her father and her brother. 3 Onassis, 3 tombs, 3 lives that had ended too soon. The island became a mausoleum. The curse of the Onassis name. Christina's daughter, Athena Onassis Roussel, was 3 years old when her mother died. She inherited the fortune, estimated at over $2 billion, but she inherited none of the happiness. She was raised in Switzerland, by her father, Thierry Roussel, and his new wife, a Swedish model named Marianne Gaby Landhage. The tabloids called her the poor little rich girl. They photographed her at school, at the zoo, at the grocery store. They speculated about when she would marry, when she would have children, when she would claim her inheritance. Athena wanted none of it. She grew up quiet, private, fiercely protective of her anonymity. She loved horses, not as status symbols, but as living beings. She spent hours at the stables, mucking stalls, brushing manes, training jumpers. She competed in equestrian events under a false name. She refused interviews. She refused photo shoots. She refused to be an Onassis. In 2005, at the age of 20, she married a Brazilian Olympic show jumper named Álvaro de Miranda Neto, known as Doda. They moved to Sao Paulo, far from Scorpios, far from the tabloids, far from the ghosts. Athena changed her name, sold most of the Onassis properties, and donated millions to equestrian charities. She has never shown interest in the shipping empire. The heir who inherited wants nothing to do with the inheritance. Scorpios, the island that Aristotle had transformed into a paradise, was sold in 2013 to a Russian oligarch named Dmitry Rybolovlev. The price was reportedly $150 million, exactly 1,000 times what Aristotle had paid 50 years earlier. Rybolovlev promised to preserve the tombs, to maintain the gardens, to respect the memory of the family. Whether he has kept that promise is a matter of debate. Tourists are not allowed. Journalists are turned away. The island remains private, silent, watchful. The tomb. Today, if you could visit Scorpios, and you cannot, unless you are a friend of a Russian billionaire, you would find the tombs of the Onassis family in a small clearing near the villa. The cypress trees have grown tall. The bougainvillea has overgrown the stone paths. The sea is the same sea that Alexander flew over, the same sea that Aristotle crossed 1,000 times, the same sea that Christina sailed in her desperate attempts to find peace. Alexander's tomb is the simplest of the three. White marble, no ornamentation, no statues, no angels. Just his name and the dates. A small Greek flag is sometimes placed there by a groundskeeper. A single candle, lit on the anniversary of his death, flickers in the wind. The inscription, as noted earlier, says nothing about being an heir, nothing about being a son, nothing about being a Onassis. It just says his name. Alexander. The one thing that was truly his. The heir who never inherited. What did Alexander Onassis inherit? Not the fortune that went to Christina. Not the empire that crumbled after Aristotle's death. Not the respect of his father that was never given. Not the love of his mother that was too complicated, too distant, too late. He inherited a name. That was all. A name that opened doors and closed hearts. A name that made him a target for tabloids and a disappointment to his father. A name that he never wanted, never chose, never learned to love. He inherited a curse. The curse of the Onassis family, the curse of too much money and too little love, of too many expectations and too few escapes, of a father who saw children as assets and a mother who saw marriage as a trap. The curse followed him from the cradle to the cockpit, from Scorpios to Helicon, from the boathouse to the burning wreckage. But he also inherited something else. Something that cannot be measured in dollars or ships or tabloid headlines. He inherited the sky. For a few brief years, between the shouting and the silence, between the boarding school and the boardroom, between the father who wanted a mirror and the son who wanted to be seen, for a few brief years, Alexander Onassis flew. He flew over the Ionian Sea at sunset, the clouds painted orange and pink, the islands below like scattered jewels. He flew through storms, trusting his instruments and his instincts. He flew at night, the stars above, the lights of Athens below, feeling something that his father's money could never buy, freedom. He was not a great pilot. He was not a great businessman. He was not a great lover, or a great son, or a great heir. He was just a young man who wanted to be seen for who he was, not for what he was supposed to become. He wanted to be loved without conditions. He wanted to be allowed to fail. He wanted to be allowed to choose. He never got those things. But for 24 years, he kept reaching for them. And maybe that is enough. Maybe the value of a life is not measured in what it inherits, but in what it reaches for. Alexander Onassis reached for the sky. And for a little while, the sky reached back.